One is no poverty, two is zero hunger, three is good health and well-being, four is quality education, five is gender equality, six is clean water and sanitation, seven is affordable and clean energy, eight is decent work and economic growth, nine is industry innovation and infrastructure, 10 is reduced inequalities, 11 is sustainable cities and communities, 12 is responsible consumption and production, 13 is climate action, 14 is life below water, 15 is life on land, 16 is peace, justice, and strong institutions, 17 is partnerships for the goals. Those are the sustainable development goals. They help us care for humanity and nature. If you remember them, the sustainable development goals, you can help the world become a better place for you and me.
Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Dr. Eliane Balijoro, the Global Hub Director for Future Earth in Canada and the Executive Director of Sustainability in the Digital Age. Today we'll be exploring theme 2 of our town halls, and this one is on enabling cross-sector partnerships to drive sustainable innovation. We would like to begin by acknowledging that we are located on unceded Indigenous lands. The Kanien'kehá:ka Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters on which we gather today. Georgiaga, Montreal is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today, it is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous people and other peoples within the community. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our partner and the founder and CEO of the Canadian Science Policy Centre, Dr. Mehrdad Harari.
Merci, Eliane. Bonjour tout le monde et bienvenue. Hello, everyone. First, I want to acknowledge the land. I'm talking to you from Richmond Hill, Ontario, the unceded territory of Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Anishinaabe peoples whose presence continue to this state. And I want to thank them and other Indigenous people for sharing this land with us. I would like to take a moment to welcome everyone and all of you, and thank you for attending this second town hall of National Dialogue series called Canada's Sustainable Future, Creating a Digital Action Plan. This series of online dialogue is hosted jointly by the Future Earth, Sustainability in the Digital Age, and the Canadian Science Policy Centre. And we'll look at how digital innovations can help Canada achieve the United Nations 17 Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. The knowledge and key findings developed during these dialogues will be presented to a large audience at the Canadian Science Policy Annual Science Policy Conference, a pre-conference symposium on November 18, and I invite all of you to participate in that. And it is important to note that the Government of Canada has provided funding for this National Dialogue series through their Sustainable Development Goals funding program. Their program, Moving Forward Together, Canada's 2030 Agenda National Strategy, is an important milestone in continuing to implement and advance the 2030 Agenda. It supports progress on the Sustainable Development Goals in Canada and abroad. With the knowledge that we gather from those online dialogues, we can provide recommendations for policymakers, nonprofits, private sector, and science stakeholders to create together a sustainable future for everyone in Canada. We'll look forward to your participation, and I'm happy to introduce our facilitator for today's session, Dr. Sylvie Plant, who is a facilitator and researcher with CSPC. She brings to us her knowledge as a doctor of social science, having completed research on innovation in public-private partnership from a social capital perspective. In her ongoing consulting work, Sylvie is assisting clients across sectors in developing capabilities and partnering strategies for digital transformation. Over to you, Sylvie.
Well, thank you, Merdad. I'm joining you all today from Ottawa, which is on the territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. This overlaps the current borders of Ontario and Quebec and reminds us that borders and boundaries are social constructs that we can work to connect. And this is relevant for our topic today, which is enabling cross-sector partnerships to drive sustainable innovation. And one of the aims of this virtual series is to identify both the challenges and opportunities that we can engage with digital technologies for sustainability targets. And so it's my pleasure to introduce to you now the keynote panelists for our discussion today, who represent different sectors, different occupations, and regions of the country. And so our panelists can open their cameras. I'll introduce them. Nizar Ladak is the Chief Executive Officer of the Digital Research Alliance of Canada, formerly known as NDRIO, joining us from Ontario. Margot Horvath is Professor of the Center for the Study of Science and Innovation Policy at the Johnson Shoyama Graduate School at the University of Saskatchewan. Liliana Diaz is a scientific coordinator of the Institut en Environnement, Développement et Société de l'Université Laval à Québec. We also have Lauren Manikin-Bay, the Department Head for Innovation and Entrepreneurship at UConn University. Karen Bakker, who's professor at the University of British Columbia and also Vice President of Strategic Initiatives at RIPEN. And Grace Kwan, who's President and CEO of Hydrogen in Motion. Welcome, everyone. We also have Anthony Blanc and Bettina Vogt, our simultaneous interpreters. We also have the privilege of having Alicia Bramlett, who's a graphic facilitator, a graphic artist from Depict. She's based in Cleveland, Tennessee. And her role is to listen, to harvest content, and represent this event with art and illustrations. And we'll get to see her work a little bit later on in the town hall, which is a real privilege, as I mentioned. So now let's dive into our discussion. And before I invite each of the panelists to give their thoughts on how to enable cross-sectoral partnerships to drive sustainable innovation, I'd like to set the stage by saying a few words about our approach and some of the working definitions that we use in formulating this theme, and also encouraging the panelists to expand on these definitions, in your comments. So what's driving our theme today is the realization that innovation, sustainable development, and digital capabilities can't be fully addressed by organizations or governments working alone. There's no single entity that has all the resources, knowledge, and people to tackle these complex global challenges. What we need is, partnerships across sectors. And so our working definition of partnerships is something that goes beyond projects and contracts to create stronger, longer-term relationships of trust and reciprocity. And this is something that needs to be worked on. And then looking at innovation, we mean by that the implementation of something new or improved that adds business, social, or public value. And the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals give us a framework to look at innovation for sustainability that includes the climate and environment, but also addresses social inequities related to health, poverty, education, and so on. So now let's dive into our discussions. I have two questions that follow the partnering life cycle. And this is a frame that we can build on to explore the intersections of digital capability and sustainability in a partnership context. So my first question is, what are important considerations in developing and structuring cross-sectoral partnerships to achieve sustainable development goals in the digital age? So at first, I'll ask Nizar and Margot to offer some initial responses to this question, and then I'll solicit a couple of comments from other panelists as well. So Nizar, how would you respond to that, the important considerations in developing and structuring cross-sectoral partnerships to achieve sustainable development goals in the digital age? Over to you.
Thank you, Sylvie. So like you and Mirdad and others, I'd like to acknowledge I'm on the unceded territories of the Wendat, Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. and I'm privileged to have that opportunity to be here. As I reflect on your question, I think the framework that I use is largely influenced by perhaps my career in a variety of different sectors. And it comes from a perspective of being person-centered in our solutions. And what I mean by that is, I spent the better part of my career in healthcare, and we would often say healthcare services need to be family-centered. When we are in service or sales relationships, we talk about being customer-centered. When we're in other environments, we talk about being researcher-centric, such as my organization. And if we begin to think about the needs of any one of the people that we serve and thinking about their needs holistically, it immediately gives way to an orientation around cross-sectoral partnerships, because it's clear that no one organization can fulfill the needs of any given individual when we think about them as holistic. And so the organization that I have the privilege of leading was actually brought together with an orientation that we needed to be researcher-centric and to stop thinking about specifically their digital use of tools such as advanced research computing, research data management, and research software. The ecosystems or the tools had largely emerged somewhat in silos. And when you ask researchers or take a researcher-centric perspective, they say, well, that's ridiculous. They're not separate. I can't operate the computer without the software, and I can't think about how to organize my data without research data management frameworks. And so you needed to bring that together. And so in many ways, I think Endrio was established, hence our new name as of yesterday is the Digital Research Alliance of Canada, was established primarily because we believed that we needed to not only bring these sectors together, but to enable the cross-sectoral partnerships that would start to meet the needs of researchers as we move into the future. I think the idea that we often recognize as Canadians as well, and maybe this is my last point, and then I'd love to hear from Margot, but is that while we're second largest in the world in terms of land mass, our spend capacity in comparison to many G7 or other nations in the world is well below what I think we need in order to compete successfully globally. And so I think as Canadians, we need to come together to perhaps use the boxing analogy is to punch above our weight. And I see provinces and territories coming together, but also recognizing the value and the contributions that industry can make to our collective efforts in terms of cross-sectoral partnerships to really support the needs of our researchers and others whether it applies to the the various tools, the digital tools that we use in our work or as researchers use to fulfill all of those variety of potential capacities. So maybe I'll leave it there and give Margot some time.
Yes, and just to link to Margot's comment, one of the things that you highlighted, Nizar, is the need in the development of partnerships across sectors sometimes to have kind of enabler organizations, boundary spanning organizations or networks that connect those different sectors in order to facilitate that understanding. So thank you for sharing that. Yes, Margot.
Thank you. Thank you, Sylvia, and thank you, Nizar. And I want to too acknowledge that I'm a member, a proud member of Treaty 4 and Treaty 6 territories here in Saskatchewan and the traditional homeland of the Métis. I have two main thoughts, one of which links to Nizar's comments. And the first one is I think it's really important as a consideration to have imagination. So Ray Bradbury is one of my favorite authors, and he says, having all of the knowledge is great. And I think as a Canadian society, we have so much data, so much knowledge, but what we really need if we're going to advance our society and civilization is an imagination. And that's a saying of Ray Bradbury, is one of my favorite authors. So I think building that future imaginary can address silo thinking. And just as an example, we have so much data in agriculture where both funding financial companies and innovative companies are building agricultural producer efficiency and profitability. And what I think is a huge potential to imagine the future is to address this hard to nudge sector into not only building digital futures for efficiency, effectiveness, and profitability, but addressing climate change. So linking greenhouse gas emissions into these digital tools that exist out there. So for me, building that imaginary would be a key important consideration that could draw across sectors and interlink considerations that don't exist now because we have a sectored approach. The second thing that I really think links to this punching above our weight is leadership. So thinking of our Canadian hydrogen strategy and our Canadian nuclear strategy, both are roadmaps, I think they're technically called. They're both fantastic documents with lots of participation with industry, academics in developing both of those roadmaps. But the leadership of bringing those together, and I think the opportunities with Glasgow are upcoming to punch above our weight, to bring together sectoral approaches that actually do link. So I'll leave it there for further comments.
Yes. Well, thank you for mentioning imagination and leadership. And as we continue to explore this creation and structuring of cross-sector partnerships, it will be interesting to explore how that is different in partnerships across sectors. But before we do that, j'aimerais donner la parole à Liliana pour ses commentaires ou ses questions sur ce qui a déjà été partagé.
Bonjour, j'ai pas entendu. Alors, merci beaucoup pour cette invitation. Je suis vraiment enchantée de pouvoir partager avec des gens de tous les coins du pays. Et je rappelle, j'avais mentionné dans le chat notre mention des lieux. L'Université Laval, où je suis, à la ville de Québec, est située à la croisée des chemins Niawantinsio, Nakina, Nitasinan, Nita Kinan et Wallaskuk, et nous honorons notre relation les uns avec les autres. Alors, merci beaucoup pour cette invitation. C'est très intéressant d'entendre dans vos contributions des réflexions que nous avons menées depuis plusieurs années avec, à l'Université Laval, différents secteurs, disciplines, des chercheurs de plusieurs horizons et des partenaires de plusieurs milieux. Et ces discussions, nous les menons pour l'appropriation du cadre des objectifs de développement durable. Donc, quelques éléments qui ressortent, à mon avis, concernent l'orientation de l'axe de réflexion que nous voulons avoir. Et il a été mentionné l'orientation vers les chercheurs, les besoins des chercheurs, comment on réfléchit pour répondre à leurs besoins. Et une des questions que nous avons posées dans un symposium récemment, c'est de comment justement la recherche peut être plus orientée vers la réponse aux objectifs de développement durable. C'est une question que les chercheurs ne se sont pas posées traditionnellement pour leur recherche, mais d'encourager la recherche pour répondre à des besoins concrets et d'éliminer peut-être cette distinction entre la recherche fondamentale et la recherche appliquée. Et c'est peut-être une avenue très intéressante pour ce qu'on a amené dans nos discussions. Et souvent, ce qu'on fait aussi, c'est d'amener les disciplines de la création. Donc, justement, pour faire écho à cet élément de l'imagination, c'est toutes les disciplines de la création, l'architecture et tous les arts peuvent aussi nous amener énormément d'éclairage et de contributions sur comment, par exemple, encourager les transformations des comportements des citoyens ou des comportements des publics que nous voulons cibler. Donc, cette réflexion, à mon avis, est très pertinente, sachant que nous avons un cadre d'indicateur canadien actuellement en vigueur depuis le mois de juin, d'inviter tous les secteurs vraiment à se positionner par rapport à ces indicateurs, voir comment son secteur peut contribuer ce qu'il fait déjà, mais en ayant un portrait plus concret de comment tous les différents secteurs contribuent, on pourrait aussi être amené à mieux identifier certaines synergies possibles et certains éléments qui peuvent nous aider à avancer. Ça serait mes commentaires pour l'instant.
Okay. Merci, Liliana. So this is great. It sounds like a thread that's connecting what our panelists have said so far is, the need and opportunity for researchers and practitioners to somehow come together and speak a common language, and to also link, basic and applied research to have, real solutions that work for sustainable development. And Liliana was talking about the use of the United Nations SDGs as a framework to do that. And I wonder, just as a quick reflection among the panelists before we go to the Q&A, if you have examples from your experiences of this balancing of research and practice happening, successfully or maybe being challenged in cross-sector partnerships. Is that something that some of you might have a comment on?
Sure, I can comment. Thank you, Liliana. It's really interesting that the University of Laval is working in the indicator, because Future Earth is also working in relation to planetary boundaries and working on establishing what could that safe operating space for humanity be, and specific indicators. So this is bringing together both research around, say, specifics like phosphorus and nitrogen at the global level, but also linking it to research on phosphorus or nitrogen, which is part of our food supply chain at the local level, and its impacts on water quality. So interlinking indicators that might be agreed on at a global level and then played out by all entities, which I mean private business, industry, governments at the local level. So it's really interesting to see a very similar approach in the Sustainable Development Goals, because they're so different from the Millennial Development Goals that we're measuring one thing. They're interconnected, they're interlinked, and they really have, I think, at the international, and I know in my own research practice, changed the way we look at governance, the way we look at a wicked problem like climate change and food security, that's going into the future and addressing that problem.
Go ahead, Grace.
I have a interesting intersection. My company is Hydrogen Motion. We've developed a solid state hydrogen storage nanomaterial, and we use the University of British Columbia Okanagan in collaboration we're retrofitting a train, a diesel electric train to hydrogen electric, and using our technology to store and dispense hydrogen, and building a low pressure refueling. But the reason I bring this up is because the intersectionality of climate change and new technologies, we need to train a entire workforce on this technology, how to apply it. And so that's why we put a collaboration together with the university to train the next generation of people who work in this very specialized field and who can actually implement the technology. So not just the researchers, but also the technicians, the engineers, the entire team.
Thank you for sharing that. And I just want to mention for everyone's benefit that Grace is joining us from a production environment, and that's what we're hearing in the background. And so not to worry about the sound. So thank you for sharing that. And so it was great, Marco, that you were mentioning the indicators that are meaningful at a local level is one of the rallying points, for achieving those intersections across these, different dimensions of sustainability and digital capabilities. And so another question that I have for our panelists is, what are some lessons learned from your practice and research on implementing and sustaining cross-sectoral partnerships to achieve sustainable development goals in the digital age? And for this, I'd like to start by asking Lauren and then Karen to offer initial responses, and then again solicit a couple of comments from the panelists. So over to you, Lauren.
Merci Sylvie. Bonjour tout le monde. Hi everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me today. I do share similar thoughts to those of you who mentioned on the chat and already spoken, and I'm really honored to bring this northern perspective from the land of the Kwanlin Dun First Nation people in the Ta'an-Quechin Council, who have allowed me to play and learn and work on their land. I did write some notes, so you'll see me reading. I wish I could have memorized this before, but we do things differently in the North, and we don't have the choice to not do so. Digitally, we are disadvantaged compared to other hubs, like many in the North. In small places, we're disconnected in ways that our families absolutely can't even imagine. I actually just got cut off of the call about 5 minutes ago for whatever internet reason that might be. And we play in extremes. I mean, we're rocking 6 hours of daylight and -40 with grizzlies, and 24 hours of 6 hours of daylight and then 24 hours of daylight in June. But we're gritty and we're creative, and it's been forcing us to come up with answers on how to achieve a quality of life. And one of the most beautiful things in the Yukon is that we have the opportunity to work hand in hand with the First Nations people of this territory. There are half of the self-governing nations in the Yukon, in all of Canada, located in the Yukon. So this way of partnership and co-creation and co-authorship is a way of doing. A lot of what I share today is going to be kind of my words and the words of many of the colleagues that I've learned from, in particular, Michael Mooney, who's the Executive Director of Creative Lab North. And one of the things that we said in discussing kind of this opportunity for us to share on behalf of the Yukon, or for me to share, is that honestly, this topic is too broad to not achieve cross-sectoral partnerships. The Sustainable Development Goals cannot happen if we don't collaborate. And Matt Galloway said it on CBC the other day, in particular in this day of COVID, is that it's been an interruption of our collective experience. And coming back to that, either Glenn using digital ways or not using digital ways, which is a lot of the ways we do things. But here are some of the things that we do up here. And I probably won't be able to share all of it because of the time that I have, but I can continue on. But we focus on people, as Nizar was saying earlier, and that we've learned that sustainable ideas and sustainability first comes from people and not ideas. So we focus on the people behind everything else. And then we collaborate, and then we co-create, and then we co-author this idea of what we want to do. The cross-sectoral partnerships that we've worked on have required us to collaborate on a deeper level around the lessons learned and the opportunities that all of these different players come in. And again, we all share a belief, a common belief, and that we are coming in with different perspectives. And we have a really fun example that if I have time around the partnership that we're doing this cross-sectoral space with the Silicon Valley, with leading executives from the Silicon Valley have come and put a telescope into the Yukon and said, how are you doing what you're doing? So it's a really fun story if I can get to it. But we're aligning sectors. We work under the principle because of all of these years of the South coming north to tell the Yukon how to do things. There is now a mindset here is that solutions have to be built by us and for us, but we do continue to seek partnerships around the world because there's so much knowledge around us that we would be lacking if we didn't take those into consideration. We use a consensus model. There is no big sector. A big sector cannot claim that it's more important than a smaller sector, and we see it every day in the Yukon. And arguably in this day and age, smaller community has the greatest need and opportunity for growth, and we need them to be the focus, which is why in the Yukon, one of the pieces that have been working the most and is the most fulfilling is that we're targeting the highest exposure populations and sectors first. So since we know we can't all do it, we have to support those that are more at risk. And then in the end, we are seeing that the fruit is much better by doing, they're stronger by doing that. And once we get the ball rolling, our strategy needs to be flexible by keeping a narrow mind on what we think is true and not adapting to perspectives and changing needs is one way to have these partnerships and then the end idea not happen. And what else do I have to say? And then here are kind of our challenges. Is that it's a long game. One of the pieces and the folks on the poll had mentioned, we timelines are different, but this is absolutely a long game. Unfortunately, we don't have a long time. But again, the reason that we're doing this is similar, but innovation in community versus silo is always going to take more time. For us, the Yukon is still not connected. Go a few kilometers out of Whitehorse and it is not 2021. Go back 20 years and you may find what it is for the rest of the nation. And then in the Yukon, our youth are not being prepared for the digital focus, except for some players are working actively to do that now. But Sylvie, merci. I think I took more than 3 minutes, but thank you, everyone.
That's all right. It's exciting to hear, from your Northern experience and the challenges that you're facing, but also how you're taking steps to prioritize. And you did mention something about COVID, having interrupted our collective experience. For many people and organizations, COVID has also highlighted the importance of connection. And you talk about, this people first approach and relationships as the way to, manage partnerships, or as a priority to put on partnership building and partnership sustaining. And the fact this takes time, this is very helpful insight for people, because again, we know the why of this theme, yes, we need to come together, but it's the how and the actions we need to take together that are challenging. And it's great that you're sharing, all of you are sharing your insights and experiences. And so I know that Karen has things to share as well on this. So over to you.
Thank you so much, everybody. And I would like to acknowledge I'm speaking to you today from the traditional territories of the Coast Salish people, Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish. I'll make 3 points, and they speak to the multiple roles I play as a researcher on digital innovation and environmental sustainability. As an entrepreneur, I am the VP of a tech company here in Vancouver, but also perhaps more importantly, as a colonial settler, as someone who's collaborated with Indigenous scholars and community organizations to explore how we could decolonize our governance of water and the environment. First, as an academic, I put a link in the chat to an article that summarizes the amazing flourishing of research that is occurring where ecology, earth science, marine science, these are undergoing a radical shift thanks to digital technologies. I won't go into details, but I want to make a key point that digital technologies really enable us to overcome 2 key challenges of 20th century environmental governance. The first challenge is a lack of data. Digital technologies enable an abundance, actual superabundance of data. And of course, artificial intelligence and machine learning techniques and data science assist with analyzing that data and enabling it to be available for regulation and enforcement and decision-making in unprecedented ways. Some of the collaboration I'm doing with UNEP speaks to this, and I've also put links in the chat to those articles. But what this does is it changes the game totally for environmental regulation, and I'd encourage all the members of government here to really think through this. Environmental regulation in the past was characterized by post hoc monitoring. That is, essentially, you might, eventually figure out who polluted the river, but the fish would already be dead. That's the tragedy of 20th century environmental regulation. But what digital monitoring allows us to do is enact real-time regulation. And there are very exciting examples across Canada, including the real-time bioacoustics monitoring of the St. Lawrence that has allowed some measurable degree of protection for the North Atlantic right whales that have come there as climate refugees. So I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I do want to note that Canada has an enormous opportunity to collaborate with international actors like UNEP to step up and lead on creating a national digital environmental monitoring framework that allows real-time enforcement. There's some great innovators out there like Montreal tech company GHG Sat that is developing real-time fugitive GHG emissions monitoring. The regulatory frameworks needed to take that science forward, for example, to penalize those emitting fugitive GHG emissions in real time, that's government's job, and that's what I see a gap and an opportunity. The next point I'd like to make, though, is perhaps more fundamental because it's ontological. Nizar mentioned person-centered, and Nizar, I love working with you, totally agree, but I would add that animals and plants are people too. That is, they are non-human persons, and granting legal personhood to non-humans, of course, now has a well-developed legal basis. Bolivia, Ecuador, New Zealand, granting legal personhood to water bodies like rivers and forests. So I think we need to think through who the people are that we're thinking about, and that the future is one in which the legal personhood of non-humans is recognized. And of course, there's a deep basis of Indigenous law in Canada that predates colonial settler law, upon which we can draw and in which we should be engaging with in a legally pluralistic society. The third and final point I want to make is about intersectionality. My own career in environmental issues has been one in which I've increasingly realized as a colonial settler the depth of the, if you like, the colonization of my own mind. So I'm not critiquing anyone else, but I'm drawing on my own experiences working with the Decolonizing Water Collective, which includes wonderful scholars like John Borrows, M.A. Craft, and Deb McGregor, all Indigenous scholars working on various environmental and water issues. So one of the learnings that I thought I would share here is that I think we will have missed an opportunity for sustainable innovation and partnerships if we don't begin from the premise that the environmental crisis is intertwined, at least in Canada, with colonialism, and that sustainable innovation will only be sustainable if we acknowledge the colonial roots of our contemporary environmental crisis. I'll give you an example. Zoe Todd, a Métis scholar at the University of Ottawa, has written a very important article that synthesizes climate science, which demonstrates, and this is actually a very shocking concept if you don't know the research, that human-induced climate change has been occurring at a global scale since the 1600s, notably the genocide of Indigenous peoples in the Americas, the Orbis spike, resulting in widespread landscape change, which led to uptake of carbon dioxide, which led to the period of global cooling, often referred to as the Little Ice Age. So colonial settler society becomes aware of climate change only recently, and we experience it as an existential, although very anthropocentric crisis. But Zoe Todd's point is that Indigenous societies have been living environmental crises for hundreds of years, because colonization is not only a political, but a biophysical process in which land is appropriated, the landscape of plants and animals changes. And it's within this context that I think we need to look seriously at sustainable innovation that must include some concept of reparations, that must include interweaving UNDRIP into our agendas and policies, regulations, and legislation at the convergence of innovation and sustainability as an opportunity for learning and innovation, because of course, Many Indigenous legal frameworks offer us powerful insights in how to structure truly sustainable innovation. I think that would lead us to a different place where we would recognize that sustainable development is an oxymoron, that economic development is inconsistent with environmental protection. And it's a hard truth that in the decades since the Brundtland Report, most planetary boundary environmental indicators, with the exception of atmospheric ozone, have actually gotten worse. So here we are in Canada, we are collective stewards of this enormously important territory with immense biodiversity. But I think we're failing ourselves if we actually adhere to a concept of sustainable development, if we don't think through the intertwining of partnerships between innovation, sustainability, and Indigenous resurgence. And I say this not as any expert in the field, but just to share my own learnings, that these conversations shouldn't be going on in isolation from one another, and then just offering, to plant the seed of what I hope could be a dialogue around these thoughts. So with that, thank you very much, Sylvie, and I look forward to the panelists' comments and the comments in the chat.
Karen, you talked about, I wanted to reiterate a couple of points because you gave a tangible example of, digital monitoring for real-time regulation as an example of these things connecting. And then you asked an important question about, who are the people? Is it only humans? And what's the impact of that on the legal frameworks that we're using? And again, a lot of food for thought for people in our audience that may have questions to explore that further. And then you made a link to actually what is our third theme in this virtual series, which we're going to be delving more deeply into next week, which is, the connection to colonization of our minds, as you call it. And so that third theme on Indigenous science and knowledge, contributing sustainable development solutions, is something that we're going to go a little bit deeper into. But I'm sure that your comments, both Karen and Lauren, have ont suscité I'm going now into French. J'imagine que vos commentaires ont suscité d'autres questions, d'autres idées pour nos panélistes. Alors, si je vous encourage à avoir des commentaires, partagez vos commentaires sur ce qui a déjà été partagé sur cette deuxième question. Any comments from our panelists on the second question?
I would talk to two things. Karen, thank you for the wonderful comments and insights. I think that was great sharing. I think I'm focusing on digital, so I'm going to go back there, but then I'm going to move back into bigger pictures because it's near and dear, I see, to Karen's heart, and I think to all of us as panelists. I think we can do a lot better. Someone in the chat put we should share software and more digital information, open source software and hardware even. And I think that's really, really important. Working with remote, Indigenous, rural communities and bringing all the benefits of what we're talking about, we really need to have that in Canada. And we've really done an excellent job to date with having information technology, telephone lines available, but we need to do better in that. We need to have data more accessible. So I still run into data that I can't access because of proprietary reasons, perhaps in South America and even in Canada. So opening that up, I love the idea of monitoring real time, and I'm seeing a lot of work done in that area with citizen science, and I think it's really engaging, really important for early warning systems in climate and building resilience of communities. But I think we can do better in that. And I think that we can demand a little bit more from industry. So oil and gas companies, they know, they monitor when they're going to have in their pipelines break in the pressure. They know when that leak happens. And I think if we actually demand more of proactive notification of that type of information, we don't have to wait until that oil's in the water and assess it at that time. So I'd love to see a bit more cross-sectoral. And now I'm going to move into the bigger picture. I put something that as another hat I sit in as a lawyer. thinking of law for the Anthropocene, whether we'll even be here, I think is really, really important. And imagining what that law could and should look like is really something that I think taking this applied approach is really important to do. So not only working in the colonial structures of law and environments, but working with Indigenous peoples who have near to the ground and traditional knowledge systems about the earth and all of our relations within it is really something. So as cross-sectoral, I think building on what Karen said, thinking about future generations is a really important cross-sectoral imagination to start developing with our climate scientists and our socioeconomic pathways into the future, what that's going to look like and what that means, and informing some of our cross-sectoral digital work that's happening right now.
That's great weaving of all of these ideas. And I'd like to bring in Grace, who, like Margot, has deep experience in the energy sector. And this is a very useful example to reflect on about this intersection of data and of sustainability. Go ahead, Grace.
Well, thank you, Sylvie. I think the intersectionality using digital platforms has been shown to be very effective. One of the largest hotel groups in the world has no property, so Airbnb, and the biggest taxi company, Uber, has no taxis. So digital technology can really leverage, the installed base of supply and connect supply and demand. That's the strength. I think in the energy field, I was thinking about the Sustainable Development Goals, affordable clean energy, responsible production and consumption. How do we connect those two for consumers? People want to do the right thing. They want to avoid and mitigate climate change. What are the actions they can take? And I think that's where the digital platforms really could leverage the supply, which we in Canada have a plethora of clean energy. Nuclear is maybe questionable, but hydro and wind and solar, etc. And we have a ton of demand. 24% of our greenhouse gas is from transportation sector. So people want to use something. Hydrogen is a great connector of that. So you're using solar or clean power to split water using electrolysis to hydrogen and oxygen. We can store the hydrogen in our tanks, and then you can use it for stationary and motive applications. So I think the digital it could really leverage the power of the consumer to choose what power we have, but that will require some assistance in deregulations, as all our stationary power right now is mostly controlled by big regulatory agencies on a provincial level. So I think there's opportunity, but there's also some challenges. I hope that answered your question, Sylvie, or spurred even more conversation.
Well, yes, it's great to get concrete examples and link them to the impact on things like regulation and policy and digital platforms. And before we transition to the Q&A, I wonder if Nizar has a comment on, and I know that Karen is putting some information in the chat as well on energy. There's such a wealth of knowledge in this panel. It's so great to be able to listen and to think about what you're saying. And I didn't mean to put you on the spot, Nizar. I just wanted to know if you had a thought.
Yeah, not at all. No, I was listening quite attentively. I do feel actually quite privileged to be surrounded by the panelists that I am. I mean, one of the areas that we're exploring as well is both in recognition, and so we find ourselves in this awkward sort of spot where both in recognition of one of our goals, which is to proliferate data centers across the country to support researcher needs, we're also recognizing that data centers in terms of greenhouse gas emissions are now ranked third on the planet, ahead of the aviation industry. And so we're in this very unusual position of trying to fulfill a goal and a mandate, and recognizing that we have a corporate social responsibility. And so ideas that we're starting to explore are actually based out of Liliana's school, where in Laval, the data center that they've built reuses energy, redeploys energy. So the excess heat, which many of you can, allow your minds to sort of imagine, of hundreds of servers interconnected through fiber and cable, is remarkable. I mean, all you have to do is think about how hot it gets on your lap when you're using your laptop. Now multiply that, to give you a context of the data centers that we're building. Your individual laptop, in comparison to the supercomputers we have, the supercomputers are 1 trillion times the speed of an individual's laptop. So you can also imagine the amount of heat that's generated. And so Laval, in its goal, has actually redeployed the heat for the campus swimming pool, the gymnasium, the cafeteria, and by default, as a result of redirecting its heat, it's also actually lowering its consumption of energy as a result. So I think, coming full circle to our topic, that idea actually was born from industry in terms of the cross-sectoral partnerships, where they're saying this is ways and means by which we're not only making our equipment more energy efficient and perhaps a little greener, and I do say that in quotes, but there are means and ways by which we can try to at least reduce our greenhouse gas emissions through these recycled reuse uses of energy.
Thank you for sharing another solution that has impact and connects back to the goals and the theme of today. What I'd like to do now is to invite all of our audience members to share their questions in the Q&A. We have a chat in the Q&A, and it's really ideal if people are able to put their questions in the Q&A, because we have in the background the team that will help to sort these ideas, these questions for our panelists, and we can continue the conversation there. And so while we're doing that, while we're putting some questions down in the Q&A, I'd like to invite Alicia, our talented graphic artist, to share what she has so far listening to this wealth of information from our panelists. I wonder, Alicia, if you have something you'd like to share with us. It's a work in progress. It's not finished, but it would be great for us to take a look at it while people are asking questions. Thank you. Look at that. So this is like a real work in progress, and we see all of these threads being weaved together. Let's just take a couple of moments to look at that. I like that you captured the importance of both knowledge and imagination at the beginning, and taking that holistic approach. And some specific examples that were shared by Grace with Airbnb and Uber. That's so wonderful. Thank you, Alicia. And we'll get to see the final product at the end as well, following the Q&A. Okay. So from Grant, which came from the Q&A box, thank you, Grant. How can we address cultural related issues that prevent collaboration? For example, the tendency to silo and egocentrism. And I wonder if I might ask Karen to share a comment on that one. And you can always ask when I point to you if you feel.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I did hear the question. The question is a profound one, of course, about two very different things, culture and ego. I don't believe that the kind of collaboration we do in Canada is going to reach the regenerative sustainability goals that we should be setting for ourselves, if our current approach to decentralized yet collaborative federalism isn't renewed, I think we will create lots of small innovations. And don't get me wrong, as an entrepreneur, I love innovation. My eyes light up when I hear about all these great projects like the one Nizar talked about. But we have a more systemic problem in Canada, which your question speaks to, about deeper collaboration and coordination. Catherine Harrison, who's a political scientist at UBC, wrote a wonderful book years ago called Passing the Buck. And it was about how, in the context of decentralized federalism, responsibility for actually making progress on environmental issues essentially falls between the cracks of fragmented jurisdictions. A great example in British Columbia is the ongoing extinction crisis of the caribou. There is no excuse in a society as wealthy as ours to be permitting the kind of activities on the land and water that is driving the caribou to extinction. And yet, projects like the Site C Dam, which were 100% electricity surplus, that project is not needed, nearly 100% cost overruns, massive infringement on treaty rights, and more negative environmental effects, not in qualitative impact, but in number, than any other project ever approved under the history of the Canadian Environmental Act. But that project was approved at all levels of government, which is why Blueberry First Nations and others are taking the government to court about cumulative effects. So unless our governments resolve this issue of jurisdictional fragmentation, and when I say governments, I'm also including Indigenous governments and traditional governments, and arrive at a different, if you like, political dispensation for reimagining how we collaborate on the landscape and on the waterscape, I think a lot of these innovations will be tinkering at the edges. And Blueberry First Nation has been right to actually go to the heart of the matter, which is we are not systematically addressing cumulative effects over time. And without that fundamental legal and regulatory change, I don't think that we will enable those people who want to transcend these issues of culture, silos, ego, to really make systemic change. So that's my plea for, it's probably a massive overhaul of environmental legislation that has not occurred since the 1970s. We need government to really dig in on that.
And so thank you, Karen, for speaking to those points about the importance of systemic change, role of government, and so on. Another dimension of this question, I think, relates to cultural-related issues that prevent collaboration, relates to international collaborations. And I know that both Liliana and Nizar have been involved in international collaborations on this topic. And I just want to ask if you have an additional comment on this particular question. C'est ça, Liliana, je mentionnais que et vous et Nizar avez une expérience avec les collaborations internationales, et au niveau des questions culturelles, je me demandais si vous aviez un autre commentaire sur cette question. Sinon, on peut passer à une autre question.
En fait, je me sentais interpellée beaucoup par la question de la gouvernance et qui avait été aussi soulevée par Margot un peu plus tôt. On n'a pas creusé là-dessus. Qu'est-ce que ça veut dire de voir la gouvernance autrement et comment probablement les défis des ODD nous obligent à voir non seulement aller au-delà des silos, comme on le mentionne souvent, mais je pense que cette question que Karen mentionne fait appel à la notion de société civile qui doit... dans beaucoup de cas, et là, si tu mentionnes la question de la coopération internationale et des expériences peut-être dans d'autres pays, ce n'est pas une question exclusive au Canada. C'est le fait que c'est nécessaire de vraiment réunir les forces vives de toute la société pour adresser des thématiques et des problèmes aussi complexes que ceux auxquels on fait face. Parce que les gouvernements tout seuls, définitivement, ils ne pourront pas. Et il n'y a pas uniquement la fragmentation institutionnelle territoriale, mais il y a également la question du court terme de toutes les administrations publiques qui peuvent difficilement avoir des projets à long terme. Donc, face à cette situation, disons que je pense qu'il y a une réflexion à avoir sur le rôle de la société civile, c'est-à-dire que il y a nous tous comme citoyens, chaque organisation, le secteur privé, et aussi évidemment le secteur académique, les universités, les OBNL, etc. Toutes sortes, toutes les organisations, les collectifs qui existent ont ce défi de se rallier, de se rapprocher pour créer une vision commune. Et comme le sondage de tantôt le disait, ça a quasiment le même poids que les besoins des ressources financières, d'avoir une vision commune pour vraiment travailler ensemble dans cette direction. Donc, c'est peut-être, bon, je ne sais pas si ça répond à la question culturelle, parce qu'évidemment, il y a une diversité énorme dans cette société civile qui est aussi souvent fragmentée pour ces raisons-là. Donc, c'est aussi un défi de générer une cohésion, de générer ces liens sociaux et pour lesquels, évidemment, le numérique a un rôle très important et il faut qu'on s'interroge sur comment le numérique doit contribuer à créer cette cohésion plutôt que à creuser la fragmentation ce qui est en train d'arriver actuellement. Donc, je pense qu'on a d'importantes leçons par rapport à la dernière année et demie où le numérique nous a permis de nous réunir comme on le fait aujourd'hui, par exemple. Et dans un pays comme le Canada, c'est très important, je crois. On a besoin de ces espaces pour pouvoir nous rencontrer parce qu'autrement, probablement, on ne le ferait pas, on ne l'aurait pas fait. Donc, vraiment, exploiter ou donner un rôle au numérique pour créer cette cohésion sociale et consolider une société civile qui soit capable d'avoir une vision à long terme.
Merci, Liliana. I think what you're saying about the role of civil society and the opportunities for digital platforms to play that connecting versus fragmenting role really connects with what Lauren was starting to tell us about what's happening in the North and how what you're doing, Lauren, with communities is really moving things forward. And I wonder if you wanted to share more about your experiences there.
Merci, Sylvie. I do, and I think it can be a couple, and I'm going to share kind of the notes that I'm referring to as I was preparing for this. But I really believe in relation to the question that it goes back to this idea of a consensus model. I mean, there isn't a day that goes by that the Innovation Entrepreneurship Team, which is a very colonial name that we've pushed back on a little bit, doesn't pose questions that I can't just go out into a rural community in Yukon of 500 people and present my challenge and have it understood, so to speak. So one of the arguably the most successful models since I have been a part of this community in the Yukon, we moved up here 5 years ago, and in my career is finding allies and aligning sectors of people that I said earlier, like believe in the same pieces. It's more work. There are power imbalances. I speak a different language. But we have gone, for example, in the Silicon Valley project that we are doing is happening largely because we've hired 2 amazing First Nation women to be our spokespeople, so to speak, because we believe in the same thing that we believe in. The digital divide is absolutely unacceptable in the North. And people in the Silicon Valley need to understand, and again, if this is just one example, but need to understand how to bridge that divide, because their careers are depending on the entire world being connected, and they have a bunch of other goals that I could get into. But this idea of we have stepped outside of ourselves, outside of our worldviews and the way that we present pieces, and we have built deliberate partnerships again with these First Nation women and the people that believe in the same thing, and then they're going out into their community and in different words than I could ever use, sharing it. And now we have essentially Government of Yukon, Creative Lab North Society, as I mentioned earlier, academia, Yukon University, and a private consulting organization that is now bringing in even more. There's a multiplier effect of other people. So Mind Fuel and Junior Achievement that believe in the same things that we do. And we're going out and delivering these tools to communities that you could never have done. And it has taken a longer time for sure. But the successes that we've seen so far in the buy-in are just game-changing in relation to a model that we're speaking about today. So, merci Sylvie, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Now, because we have so many questions and I know we won't get to all of them, I'd like to combine a couple of questions which might make it more challenging. And this is around, data, information, and knowledge. So one question came from Felipe in the Q&A and about, misinformation spreading like wildfire and often limiting our ability to tackle major social issues. He says, think the pandemic of misinformation we're going through. How can we ensure our sustainability and climate change efforts do not fall short because of this? So that I will make that part one of the question, because we have another question that came in from Ryan. Now, this was in the chat. And you can see, if you see a connection, is what does the panel feel the role of open source software and hardware in cross-sector collaboration? And so wondering if there's a connection between open source and tackling misinformation, or any angle you want to take on that. Who's interested to tackle that?
Nizar has a hand up.
Go ahead, Nizar.
I don't have a full answer, but I am intrigued by the question, and maybe I'll attempt a bit of an answer, and that might trigger one of my panelist colleagues to sort of continue. I think what we have, first of all, to Felipe's question, I do think what we have by virtue of the proliferation of information is a cultural cross-section where we still have a segment of society who's even questioning that we have a global climate crisis. We have individuals, that are not individuals, but the ability to communicate information, as Felipe, very nicely states about the understanding what's real. And so there are people out there who are saying there is no global climate crisis, there is no, melting, and this is not a situation where it's a small number of people. There are hundreds of millions of people who believe that, discussions of this. And then we have world powers who stand up and argue that it's not as bad as we're all making it out to be. And so I think you can't blame necessarily the technology that's made the misinformation. You have to blame the way in which we're receiving the information, and the ability to wholeheartedly accept, I think, perceptions. When, as much as I believe in science, when the vaccine came out, I did my own research to understand it before I put it into my children's bodies. When people tell us certain things, I think there's an obligation on our collective part to use the tools and the tactics that we've garnered through our abilities to be able to sort of filter that. Even as I say that, though, I recognize that there's a social dimension to us. Not everyone has the tools, and I'm speaking from a position of privilege by virtue of my educational background. And so then what is our collective responsibility in providing fair information and accurate information to broader audiences? So this is where I say I don't have a full answer, because as you try to answer and unpack these very complex questions, you almost find yourself going down in a rabbit hole to say, well, we could try this, but what about this? And what about this? At the end of the day, if I was to leave it on a positive note, the fact that we're even trying, I think, moves us forward in terms of our knowledge production and our knowledge exchange. So I don't know if anything I've said triggers some thoughts amongst my panelist colleagues.
Yeah, it's good to look at these questions with more questions, because we need to first develop understanding. So we have Margot and Karen. Is it Margot first? Go ahead.
No idea, but I can go. I think Karen might have been first.
Oh, okay. Go ahead,
Margot,
Karen.
Margot, you go.
Okay. I actually, I love the parallel drawn with climate change denialism. And I've been watching for decades, as I'm sure several of the panelists have been, the climate change denialism surveys and research in North America specifically. And there has been improvements in climate change and eradication of denial. And in fact, now I would submit that delay is the new form of denial, that is completely unacceptable in North America and Canada at this time to deny climate change. And this has only been in about the last 5 years where politicians, and coming from Saskatchewan, Alberta, I can say this, cannot go publicly anymore with any type of denial. So I think we can learn from that. And we can also learn, of course, from the tobacco communications and misinformation that occurred then, and fast forward it to today's situation. So I do believe international organizations, climate scientists, like we have here today, have done an incredible job at always speaking up at falsehoods. And I see it now with public health authorities in relation to COVID. But I do want to put a push for science. So I do believe that interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary research is really important, but so is disciplinary research that we can do with big data on what nudges and pushes, and behavioral economics or social psychology does in relation to people and their embracing vaccines and behavior that's protective in COVID. So we can't lose sight of important disciplinary information in that and how it does change society. But we need the big data to know if it really does change, right? Looking at the influence of Facebook and TikTok, I think I got that right, on our young people. So we know that surveys don't reach them anymore as scientists. So we need to engage with them. And we're starting to, here in the Center for Science and Innovation Policy, engage with younger demographics of 12 and up and what their thoughts are around everything from COVID to climate change, and what the messaging is that resonates with that crowd.
Yes, that's a really important point about engaging differently with different populations in order to improve the quality of data and then to be able to tap in that big data. So thank you for sharing that. Karen, what did you want to share?
So I've launched 2 tech companies, one of which I ran as CEO, raised VC funding in Silicon Valley. That company was acquired. I now am VP of another company that is backed by American venture capital. And so when I hear about Silicon Valley and I hear about digital innovation, at one level, I'm excited. I know about the excitement. At another level, I'm very worried, because the current form of capitalist structure under which corporations operate is, of course, a fiduciary duty to maximize returns to stakeholders. In Canada, we do have examples of alternative corporate structures that have been created, like the community benefit corporations here in British Columbia, or B corporations, a global movement. Not many tech companies are B corporations. So we have a misalignment of incentives. First, to maximize profit, but we're talking about protecting the environment. Those are not always going to be commensurable. The war will be waged at the level of data, or partially at the level of data. Data is incredibly valuable. Environmental data is pretty much an unregulated zone of accumulation for big tech companies right now. When we worry about harvesting people's data, we put in all these safeguards, but there are no parallel safeguards for environmental data. And the assumption usually is that environmental data does not belong to anyone, because non-humans are not legal persons, and therefore we can appropriate the data, process it, and benefit from it. And of course, the massive rise of investment like Microsoft's AI for Earth, various investments in environmental data initiatives by a number of large tech companies are something we should watch closely. But make no mistake, the motive is data colonization and profit. Now, there are safeguards we could establish, and Canada actually should be a leader in this, without which we will fall prey to what Shoshana Zuboff at Harvard calls surveillance capitalism. But we will have eco-surveillance capitalism, and we will not control our environmental data. We will not be able to direct it to the best uses. We need to have a collective conversation about this and stop assuming that data is free. The Indigenous data sovereignty movement is a powerful challenge to this. Much of this data actually belongs to Indigenous peoples from which the data is harvested. So we're going to need to have a new law in Canada that aligns these data harvesting practices with Indigenous sovereignty and UNDRIP. But beyond that, we need to get a handle on how, as a country, we can begin to take charge of ownership and become stewards of our environmental data. And again, UNEP is doing some fascinating work on creating a global architecture for environmental data as a commons. But I believe in Canada, we need to get up to speed on this, because that global commons of data will be the foundation for a lot of the sustainable innovation we're all talking about. And without that, we're not going to be able to have a lot of the partnerships we would wish to have.
Thank you, Karen. You talked, of course, about safeguards for data harvesting, and just now about the global commons of data, which is something that came up in our first theme last week around raising awareness for this. But one of the things you talked about, which is a challenge to be overcome, is this misalignment of incentives across sectors and data. So I think this is something that Grace can speak to from her experience with Hydrogen in Motion. And I wonder, Grace, if you have comments on that, about this misalignment of incentives across sectors and what can be done to address that and to support cross-sectoral partnerships.
Hi, Sylvie. Thank you both. Misalignment. I mean, I think it's difficult to say, excuse me, about incentives, as there's a wide spectrum of needs and desires from academia, SME, innovators, people in different, excuse me, areas of their growth. And I think it's difficult to navigate. That's a certainty. I used to run the Centre of Excellence Grants Contribution for the Treasury Board of Canada, and it's a complicated system. There's many grants contributions. They never completely cover all the expenses, and so I think the real downfall of our Canadian grants and contributions system is that it encourages dilution of our SMEs while they're very vulnerable. So we have one of the most educated populations in the world, and because of that, there's very many innovators and new companies, many SMEs, but there's very few MNEs or large corporations. And why is that? It's because the capital system of we're leveraging grants and contributions, but with that 50% or 75% leverage, we need to bring in a private capital, and that private capital is, as Karen mentioned, is I wouldn't say necessarily predatory, but very self-interested in making sure that they reap the gains of that capital, and therefore we see these companies after a couple of rounds move to the US or wherever the source of capital comes from, and they're no longer a Canadian company. So our current system encourages brain drain and is not doesn't facilitate the industrial growth of Canada as a whole, in my opinion.
Thank you for that. So many different dimensions are being addressed in the comments, and I see one of the questions that came up from Glenn, which talks about sustainability is a complex, many-headed reality. If you could only work on one habit, a keystone habit that would work on many others, what habit do you want to champion? And I would like to preface, or add to that question by saying that a lot of the things that you're talking about address the need for systemic change across the country, internationally. And there are certain things, but you've also talked about the people dimension and how important that is. So in answering that question of what's one keystone habit, I'd like you to think of maybe what is a personal habit for people engaging in these cross-sectoral partnerships that you would want to champion in these efforts. And also what's a more institutional habit, building on all of the comments that have been shared. And I know this is a challenging question, and I wonder who would like to explore it a bit. Keystone habit that you would like to champion to address all of this. Lauren, did you want to say something?
I did, and then I I just want one more minute to think, but I'll go for it. And I think it's simplistic. I mean, my colleague panelists are coming with this another kind of sense of experience than what I come to. So the work that I do has been founded on this really human-centered approach, similarly to what everyone else is saying. And I would, for me, the habit in relation to these kind of conversations, these cross-sectoral pieces, thank you, Glenn, for the question, is to bathe in the uncomfort, like be comfortable in those uncomfortable moments. I'm fast acting and ideas abound, et cetera, but the moment to pause, I think then allows me to listen more deeply, seek other advice, and reposition in this much larger picture that is outside of my ego and outside of my experience, because we're not going to get to our goals without the minds and hearts of the people around us.
Thank you for that. Anyone else want to share a keystone habit for ourselves? Grace, go ahead.
Well, I think the complexity of this thought piece requires us to be constantly updating our knowledge. So I think the habit of just hearing other voices, understanding perspectives, and seeing what the cutting edge is very useful in any context, but especially something as complicated as these cross-sectorial and digital intersections. It's a lot of different perspectives, lots of different data, and it grows organically. It's always changing. So I think there's a lot of bright eggs in this basket. Something will hatch eventually.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead, Zara and Margot.
Margot was before me, so please, Margot.
Go ahead, Margot. Thank you.
I'm not sure I was. Yeah, I had to Google for a while to figure out keystone, but I think a keystone habit for me is curiosity. And I'm very curious. And I think a good science and policy innovator is curious about everything. And it didn't kill the cat, but it makes life really interesting. And I find myself in very, very different places. So whenever any person or colleague or researcher or person I'm interviewing has a perspective, I'm very curious as to why. And I'm very curious too when I hear false news or when I hear a very closed opinion about something. So one closed opinion is that we can't function without just wind and solar energy. So I'm very, very curious why big utilities don't believe that could actually be the case here in -50 winters in Saskatchewan. I'm curious about that. But I'm also, on the flip side, I'm very curious about nuclear energy. So in Ontario, 70% of the grid is nuclear and it's clean, and it's one of the things that gives Canada its advantage. So I'm really curious of why people with Canada's leading position in the world with countries that are nuclear, why people have such a reaction to it. And I know all the reasons, but the curiosity when our cancer, like these are interconnected ecologies with my relatives who are receiving cancer treatment that's coming from the nuclear plant in Ontario. So I'm really curious about everything actually, and trying to be open-minded with that curiosity.
That's great. Nizar, what is your thought?
So I, like my panelists, I want to thank Glenn for the question, because this is it's really pushing the limits of my brain. And I'm hearkening on, like Margot, the terminology of keystone habits. So I interpret that. So forgive me, Glenn, if I've misinterpreted your question, but I interpret it as a keystone habit is what's the one thing that's potentially going to result in the kind of big change that I think all of us want. And yet I'm stuck on the synonymousness, if that's a word, how complex is often for me synonymous with gray. What I mean by that is most things, if they were easy, we would have done them by now. And so the nature, the very fact that it's a complex question requires us to be comfortable, as Lauren has said, in being, bathing ourselves in discomfort, as Margot is saying, in terms of continuing to be curious. I think it's a recognition that the solutions to many of these complex or wicked problems requires an ability to sort of balance both the sort of one dimension of perspective or an answer and with another, and recognizing that there's two truths to every story, or two truths to all stories, and perspectives to all stories, and the truth lies in the middle to some degree, and recognizing that true change will come when we can agree on that in many respects. So what I often say to my children, what I say to my colleagues and my coworkers, is that simple solutions come from being able to free your mind from the sort of boxes that we place our heads in, and saying it's always been this way, right? And so I think in many ways I'm aligning myself to Lauren and Margot's answers, which is, if we say let's remove the limits of our thinking and find our way to solving the solution in that way, I think we might get there.
Mm-hmm. And this balancing of perspectives may link in our conversation next week to the two-eyed seeing that many Indigenous people refer to as well. And so, yeah, thank you for sharing that and staying in the gray. It's great to be able to stay in the gray for a little while anyways. Karen, what are your thoughts?
So I offer this suggestion of a habit tentatively, because I'm aware it could be recolonizing as well as decolonizing, but continuing with the theme I opened up with, I think an interesting habit for those of us living in Canada would be to go out and find out what Indigenous languages arose from the land and water where you are living. So my friend M.A. Kraft, who's an Anishinaabe scholar, once said to me that the land names itself. And I don't think I fully actually understood what that means, but I think it's a window into actually learning about the land we live in, because currently we operate with a fairly profound psychological and physical dissociation from the landscape. I teach UBC's largest class on environment and sustainability, 200 undergrads every year. Every year I ask them to raise their hands if they've ever been to Asia or Europe, nearly all 200. I ask how many of them have been north, almost none. So we have a profoundly colonial mindset. We don't know our own land. So, the maxim, if you don't know your own history, you're doomed to repeat it. I think when we don't know our own geography, we're doomed in a different way. And so I feel like one way to get to know the land is to learn the names, the words from the land. My friend Oscar Dennis wrote a thesis on the Tahltan language, and one thing he taught me was the Tahltan word for river is a word that is a compound word of the word for water and the word for maternal uncle. Maternal uncles playing a very important role in Tahltan culture in the guidance of young children. To make a long story short, the evocative explanation of the etymology of the Tahltan word for river gives us an understanding that the river is a person, the river actually is a senior person to be respected, and the many small streams leading into the river are like the children connecting with their uncle and perhaps an ancestor. So when we learn the words about the land and the etymology of the words, we begin to rethink some of our core assumptions, which begins to point to the power imbalances inherent in two-eyed seeing. I really do acknowledge the importance of trying to engage in two-eyed seeing, but I think we also need to acknowledge the profound imbalances. So that keystone habit, maybe of learning the words and then rethinking our own preconceived notions, might help advance dialogue and yeah, that's my suggestion.
Yes, so knowing the words is so relevant, of course, to understanding nature and land and so on. And knowing the words is also important for those digital tools that can help us. I want to acknowledge one of the questions that came in the Q&A from Kathleen about, any thoughts about blockchain, crypto with regards to digital and sustainability. And I don't know if we have time to explore it fully with the panel, but I do encourage panelists and others to provide some answers in the chat for that. But we can bring this and other topics that came up in a closing circle that I'd like to suggest, where I would like to hear from each panelist, and I'll call them in reverse order from what we did at the very beginning, and really to ask them, because the purpose of these virtual events are to connect with one another, understand some synergies around these topics, but also generate data to build a digital action plan for a sustainable future for Canada. And so that's the question that I would like to ask each panelist is, what would be a closing recommendation, one thing that you would want to see in a digital action plan to contribute to Canada's sustainable future? And so I'll start by asking Grace if there's one thing coming from this reflection and your experiences that you think should be in that digital action plan.
I would like to see in the digital action plan a way of just getting society involved, sort of a not just accountability but actual engagement. There's so many smart people in the country who really want to make a difference in the world, and sometimes these action plans are very high level and expect government or academia to take the lead. And I think societal change can be done at a community level, and having a platform or a pathway forward on that would be really empowering.
Mm-hmm. When we had our Theme 1 town hall last week, this notion of solutions coming from communities and the need to listen to communities is also something that came up. So thank you for sharing that. It's nice to see, it's interesting to see the connections. And so again, going in my reverse order, Karen, what would be one item that you would like to see on the digital action plan?
The incorporation and the the full ramifications of UNDRIP and Indigenous data sovereignty for rethinking the very nature of the digital as well as the data sovereignty piece. UNDRIP has profound implications for every aspect of innovation and sustainability. I will also put a very interesting article in the chat by Jason Lewis at Concordia, who's an Indigenous scholar who's working at the intersection of artificial intelligence and Indigenous scholarship. And I know Eliane knows Jason as well, and some interesting perspectives there on Indigenous approaches to AI. So the reason I want to put that article in the chat is to signal this is not only an issue of data ownership by Indigenous communities, but to open the conversation around the profoundly important perspectives that Indigenous thought can have to how we conceive of the digital. So I'll leave it there, let Jason and colleagues' articles speak for themselves, but it won an award at a recent MIT competition and is well worth reading on this point.
Yeah, thank you so much to you and everyone who's sharing resources in the chat. It's really a wealth of knowledge at the intersection of all these important topics. Lauren, what would you like to see in a digital action plan for a sustainable future?
I would like to see a requirement in proof that we are collaborating, that one organization or one institution or one research, et cetera, cannot do it alone, and that we have to see multiple representation of ideas at all levels.
You know, that's great. You're talking about proof that we're collaborating. And I always like to ask about, you know, measures of success. How will we know that, you know, something is happening? And so, you know, if we have time, maybe we can expand on these measures of success for these different items, because that's what will support, you know, accountability. So thank you for sharing that. And so now going back in, I'm trying to go back and make sure I go in the proper order. Who was the last person that I asked? I think it was Liliana. Liliana, quelle serait votre recommandation pour un plan d'action numérique?
Je suis tout à fait d'accord avec les points qui ont été soulevés précédemment, et c'est vraiment, je pense, une stratégie ouverte, effectivement, une stratégie qui accueille les propositions de tous les secteurs, et peut-être d'une manière dynamique, parce que je pense que le numérique peut vraiment nous aider à avoir un portrait de qui fait quoi, où et qu'est-ce qui peut être fait pour compléter, bonifier ou avoir un impact plus grand. Donc, je pense que c'est une pièce maîtresse vraiment pour notre tableau de bord. Par rapport aux ODD, quelles sont les priorités qu'on se donne, qui se donnent les différents secteurs, et comment, disons que voir le portrait complet dans une telle stratégie, ça pourrait aider à identifier les priorités et identifier aussi les actions à mener pour ceux qui veulent contribuer. Par rapport à la question qu'on posait tantôt, quelles sont les qualités? Je pensais à plusieurs choses, mais je me disais, les qualités pour avoir des partenariats efficaces, peut-être que c'est de se demander d'abord qu'est-ce que je peux apporter, quelle est ma force, et qu'est-ce que les autres sont en train de faire, et quels sont les besoins auxquels je peux contribuer. Et ces questions-là sont difficiles à se poser. On ne peut pas se les poser à l'écart. Il faut se les poser avec une bonne connaissance du contexte et de tout ce qui est déjà fait par toutes les contributions ailleurs. Donc, c'est ce que je suggérerais pour une stratégie numérique.
Mm-hmm. Merci, Liliana. As you say, and I think as others have said, it's important to get a full picture of not only the data and content of things, but the context, and to have an understanding of that, and in order to be able to take action. And of course, digital tools can help us to have that more holistic appreciation. But as has also been discussed, it's not just the existence of data, it's how is it accessed, how is it analyzed, and how is it used, and how is it connected. And so, and then connecting that, as you were saying, to understanding what our individual role could be, because sometimes it seems so challenging for any single individual to tackle these challenges. So thank you for saying that. Margot, what would be your perspective on a recommendation for a digital action plan?
I'm going to be a little unconventional and say I'm not sure I would like to see yet another strategy or action plan. I'd like to see I would like to see a cross-sectoral digital operationalization all the way from some of the very interesting programs that were announced in the last budget, including the infrastructure bank that's funding transmission and distribution systems throughout Canada, the Net Zero Accelerator program. So I would actually like to see built into all of the research funding, as well as these industry funding programs, the requirement that cross-sectoral digitalization actually be front and center. So using even climate change as an example, we've got Working Group 1 of the IPCC that does climate science, Working Group 2 does adaptation, 3 does mitigation. Well, that's almost sectoral in a sense. So bringing that same data, all of it together, I think on the landscape and in the country would actually advance this discussion. So having one more strategy is probably the starting point. But actually, if we can build that foundational policy, interwoven program, funding, research, reality, I think I would prefer to see something like that on the ground.
Mm-hmm. Yes, operationalization is definitely a key word that gets us closer to impact. As you say, many actions have been identified, and it's through that operationalization that we can start to see some results and be able to apply some of these indicators of success. And so thank you for sharing that perspective. I know in doing digital transformation projects myself at the moment, there's very much a strong imperative in the government, for example, where I do work to see results sooner, not another strategy. So yes, obviously everything that we've said about strategies and developing understanding and context is important, but that operationalization is an important point as well. So thank you for sharing. And Nizar, what would be your recommendation?
So I actually agree with a lot of what my colleagues have said on the panel. My recommendation would be in the very approach by which we establish the digital action plan. And in some ways, it's kind of nice that I get to go last, because my argument is that it would be a cross-sectoral approach. I think what we're noticing in academia and other areas is something, whether you want to call it open science, whether you want to refer to it as something that the National Sciences Foundation in the United States have been preaching for at least 7 or 8 years, something that they term convergence research. And others before them have spoken about the fact that you need to apply a variety of interdisciplinary thought processes to these difficult challenges. By virtue of my role, one of my joys is I get to work with researchers from across the country who are tackling some of literally the issues that are going to change how humanity progresses, from climate change researchers to people who are tackling cancer or other things. And I think those who are achieving success are often those who bring a variety of interdisciplinary perspectives. And we actually only need to look at our recent example of COVID, where we actually got shots in arms in a 12-month period during the largest public health crisis of our lifetime, for the people on this panel. And we did so because data was produced and they opened it up and they said, look, there are potentially 77,000 chromosomal combinations by which a vaccine would be produced. Scientists from the United States were engaged, in particular the University of Illinois, who is home to the world's largest and fastest supercomputer, the Summit. And in 3 days, they said, give us the data. In 3 days, they said they turned it to 70 from 77,000 possible human chromosomal combinations. And they gave it to Big Pharma and they said, okay, now work with this data set. And that's actually the only reason that we got in, shots in arms. And so I say that I think when we think about a digital strategy, it must be one that involves a variety of individuals with a variety of perspectives and a variety of frameworks and trainings. And sustainability is not any one human, and as I've been advised by Karen, non-human situation. We need to, we need to take into consideration that the answers lie beyond traditional means. Learning indigenous languages and other things, I think, will open our mind to solving this crisis.
Yes. So thank you, yes, Nizar, for saying it's not only what we do, but how we do it. And I can appreciate in our topic of cross-sectoral partnerships to drive sustainable innovation, that the way that this very project and town hall has been assembled is through a cross-sectoral partnership to drive sustainable innovation, you know, with Future Earth and sustainability in the digital age and Canadian Science Policy Center. And it's good to be able to reflect on these themes from the inside out, as you have been able to do. So I want to thank so much all of our panelists today. We've learned so much from you, and you know, it will take some time to review the information that you've shared, and also to our participants who've shared some great insights and questions in the chat and the Q&A. And I'd like again to give an opportunity to Alicia to share her drawing, and for all of us to take a look at her drawing and see if we have any reflections or any comments. It's really evolving so well. And so let's take a look at that. Thank you so much, Alicia, for your attention and your insights. There's so much there. And as we're looking at the drawing, I want to just give you a sense of what we're going to do with all of this information. What are the next steps? We're going to be synthesizing the information for the three themes that happened last week around raising awareness, this week around cross-sectoral partnerships, and next week around Indigenous knowledge and science. We're going to be sharing that at a symposium that's going to take place as part of the Canadian Science Policy Conference taking place on November 18th. And so now let me bring it back to Eliane for her closing comments. Over to you, Eliane.
Hello, everyone. This has been such a rich conversation, and the chat has just been exploding with knowledge. I really think this report is going to be very long because there's just so much great information. So we've come to the end of our second town hall, and I'd like to thank all of you for joining us in this engaging discussion. Karen, Margot, Nizar, Grace, Liliana, Lauren, you have been amazing. Thank you for sharing so much wisdom with us. And Sylvie, thank you for the excellent moderation. And Alicia, as always, thank you for the amazing graphic representation. So our third town hall on Indigenous science and wisdom and knowledge, driving transformative solutions, is next week. It's on Wednesday, October 6th. You can register from our Eventbrite portal or from the link in the chat box. Thank you again, and please enjoy this closing song that was written by Carrie-Anne Cutts and graciously shared with us.
Can you hear what I'm saying, what I'm preaching, what I'm praying? That with all our voices ringing, we can change the world we live in for the better, for the good of all. Can you hear what I'm saying, what I'm preaching, what I'm praying? That with all our voices ringing, we can change the world we live in for the better, for the good of all. Give every child the right to learn, to read, to write, so that the light within her burns. She'll lead the way. Give every woman the right to live with opportunity, with equality, so she may give to the world all the gifts that are do. Can you hear what I'm saying, what I'm preaching, what I'm praying? That with all our voices ringing, we can change the world we live in for the better, for the good of all.
Give every man the right to be free, to be the best he can, to make his dreams reality.
He'll live in harmony. Let every creature